Hi, I'm Mr. Rosengrant, and I'm a high school counselor. And in this video, we're going to talk about college entrance exams like the SAT and the ACT. And we're going to talk about how things might be changing now with the worldwide coronavirus pandemic. On the call here with us today, we have Bob Schaeffer. He's the Interim Executive Director of FairTest.org. Bob, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for the opportunity.
And let's just get started just by kind of the basics. What are the SAT and ACT tests, and what do colleges use them for? What are they supposed to do?
Well, the SAT and the ACT are the two major college admissions tests used historically in the United States to help sort through college applicants. The SAT is almost 100 years old. It was invented to serve the needs of highly selective universities in the Northeast, but it expanded over the last 50 years or so to become a national test of high school students. It alleges that it measures their college readiness. It used to be called the Scholastic Aptitude Test, and then they decided they didn't know what aptitude means. Then they called it the Scholastic Achievement Test, and they decided that that's redundant. They could have called it the Scholastic Test, since assessment and test mean the same thing. And now they say SAT stands for nothing, which we agree with. But it is the name of a product that is given to close to 2 million high school students each year. The ACT is a relative newcomer only compared to the SAT's 100 years old. The ACT is about 70 years old and was invented to be an alternative to the SAT by critics of that generation who believed that the SAT wasn't really measuring scholastic aptitude, and the ACT is more self-consciously designed to measure mastery of high school subject areas like English and math and reading and science.
So sometimes students have the question of which one should I take and what's the difference? So it sounds like the SAT that has mainly English and math sections, where the ACT also has an additional science component. Does that sound right?
Yeah, they have a section labeled science. It's largely not doing science, obviously, because it's a multiple choice test. It's a science reading test. And there are science-related problems on the reading test and the SAT. Basically now, over the years, the two companies have moved to the center of the marketplace. It's like Coke versus Pepsi or McDonald's versus Burger King. They do the same thing in slightly different ways. Some people prefer one to the other, and they're both problematic.
Some colleges have different admission criteria. Each college is kind of its own business, so to speak, and they decide what you need to have in order to apply to this college. So for a long time, a lot of colleges required that high school students take one of these tests, the ACT or the SAT, and submit their scores to the college as part of the application. So how do colleges use these scores?
You're correct. I mean, through the end of the last century, it was typical that colleges required applicants to submit either ACT or SAT scores. But particularly in the last 20 years, there's been a growing test optional admissions movement. Places like Muhlenberg in Pennsylvania and Gettysburg were vanguards, leaders in that movement, dropping admissions testing requirements many years ago and doing just fine. In the past 20 years, in the 21st century, we've seen an explosion of colleges going test optional, including large public institutions like Temple in Philadelphia, to the point that pre-pandemic, up through, say, the middle of March of this year, there were already 1,070 four-year colleges and universities in the US that did not require applicants to submit ACT or SAT scores if they chose not to. And that was about 45% of all colleges in the US. With the pandemic and the shutdown of testing centers, cancellations of SATs and ACTs, colleges themselves having to shut down, and all the disruptions that have come from COVID-19, another 600 or so colleges and universities have announced short-term test optional policies, at least for current high school seniors, and in many cases for underclassmen as well. So now there are, the class of 2021, 1,685 four-year schools that don't require ACT or SAT scores. That's 73% of all four-year colleges in the country. And it includes both small liberal arts colleges, local universities like Millersville, big state systems like the Penn State system, highly selective Ivy League schools like the University of Pennsylvania, Harvard, and Yale. Everywhere on the spectrum, they're all pretty much test optional for current seniors, and many of them will continue those policies for current juniors and sophomores. But you need to check to be sure.
So in the past, a lot of these schools required the SAT test, but with the pandemic, a lot of these schools are going test optional. Some students aren't sure what that exactly means, test optional, and some schools say they're test blind, and kind of what's the difference between the two. And if a school is test optional, does it still benefit them as far as it from an admission standpoint to submit test scores if their test scores are pretty good? Is there a benefit to that, or is it better to not take it to begin with?
Well, there are two questions there. Let me take the easier one first. What's test blind versus test optional? Test blind means that if you submit a test score, it will not be considered in the admissions process. At those schools, and there are now 68 of them in the country, I don't believe any in Pennsylvania, all have decided that test scores don't provide any useful data and often just reflect, on average, an applicant's socioeconomic status. There's an extremely strong relationship between ACT, SAT scores and family income, family wealth. Partly it reflects the ability to get test coaching, partly it reflects the test measure accumulated opportunity over time. But the bigger question, and I know one that concerns lots of parents, students, counselors, is test optional real? Again, we had an experience with 1,070 schools that were test optional pre-pandemic, places like Temple, and optional met optional. Since the pandemic, about 600 schools have signed on to a statement that says optional means optional. And by definition, that means you will neither be advantaged nor disadvantaged in the admissions process by deciding to submit a test score. Now, I know that doesn't answer all questions. Students have to make their own judgment, hopefully with the advice of professional counselors, as to whether there's even any value in submitting the test score. You don't have to if you think it's a plus to your application, in the same way that being president of the science club, or the head of the debate team, or an extremely gifted athlete or musician is a plus, then go ahead and submit test scores. But if you don't think it's a plus, if it's just average or less than average, there's no reason in the world in the current environment to even bother about taking the ACT, SAT, let alone submitting scores. And what we've seen from announcements of schools who in their early admissions process and their initial test optional cycle is that there wasn't an advantage either way to submitting scores. Now, I can't say that's true for every one of the 2,300 plus four-year schools in the country, but admissions directors tend to be honest folk, and they say if scores don't matter, they really don't matter.
Well, that's good to hear. And that's why we do videos like this, because colleges are so different. And,
and there's lots of rumors out there, and there are a lot of people who have vested interests in trying to promote kids risking their lives to take tests. The testing companies themselves, the College Board that makes the SAT is $1 billion a year business. The chief executive was paid $7 million last year. They want you to take tests, not because it's in your interest, but it's important to their economic survival. And unfortunately, many smaller test coaching companies see test optional admissions as an existential threat to their livelihood. If kids aren't taking tests and they won't spend money on buying test prep steroids and boosting their scores, and those companies would have to go out of business and their principals would have to get real jobs. So they use all kinds of scare tactics to claim that you have to have test scores. You don't. And particularly in places that are still heavily infected by COVID, there is no test in the world worth a student's life or a faculty member's life to proctor. You don't have to take them this year. Don't do it if there's any health risk, no matter where you're applying.
Well, that's a good point. And what about special cases? Like there might be some students watching this video that are homeschool students. Some of those kids don't have necessarily like a traditional high school transcript where, you know, if a college is looking at a high school student, they can see a transcript, they can see all the classes they've taken, the grades, the GPA, their rank. That might not all be available to a homeschool student. Do colleges still sort of want to see an SAT or ACT test from these students?
Oh, that's a great question. And even pre-pandemic, schools that were test optional for 95% of their applicants, in many cases still required ACT, SAT scores from homeschooled students because there wasn't a transcript. And a transcript provides lots of information, plus those grades include lots of tests that were made by teachers and other forms of assessment like science projects and whatnot. Homeschooled, it's harder to tell. Applicants are going to have to check with each school where they intend to apply about the specific policies for homeschool students. In some cases, they're vague. They're often ever changing. So, you know, there's not a one size fits all answer to that one. Check it out. In many cases, the testing waiver applies to all applicants, including homeschoolers.
The SAT and the ACT test, what they're supposed to do, as far as I understand, is help colleges see whether or not this applicant is ready for college or, you know, is prepared for college. Now, we also send the transcript that has all of their classes. It shows what level of classes they've taken in high school. It shows what grades they've gotten. Some of these students are taking college level classes here in the high school with dual enrollment and things like that. How well does the SAT or ACT test do with what it says it's trying to do, which is determining college readiness?
Well, I think that's the fundamental question and one that has led to explosive growth of test optional admissions. Tons of research, including by the test makers themselves, show that the SAT and SAT are poorer predictors of undergraduate success than that transcript, than the high school record. That there is more useful information in the classes a student has taken, the grades she's received, the rigor of those courses, plus all the other information in an application portfolio, extracurricular activities, leadership, community service, obstacles overcome, special talents, that schools don't need test scores. They don't add useful information to what is already available. And in addition, when schools provide transcripts, they make available a school profile report, which talks about, you know, what kinds of kids that attend the high school, you know, what their overall average performance is, what percentage go on to college, et cetera. And that helps colleges put that transcript into a broader context. So, you know, schools have shown over and over again that you don't need test scores to make fair and accurate admissions decisions.
And you touched on a few things earlier. You know, we talked a little bit about the risks of going to take the SAT test during a pandemic where you could potentially be infected. And the fact that maybe the SAT doesn't even do that great of a job compared to just the transcript that colleges already have. And you touched a little bit about some of the inequities. Can you talk a little more about some of the other criticisms about these tests?
Well, as I said, you know, test scores relate more strongly to family income than to college success. In addition, tons of research shows that the tests are biased against many groups. For example, the SAT, young women score lower on the SAT and ACT than young men, but do better in college when matched for identical courses. So either these two tests are wrong or all the colleges in the country are wrong about what academic success is. So the tests are gender biased. In addition, They're biased against kids whose home language is not English and who have grown up in non-typical circumstances. Also, for older applicants to college, which is the fastest increasing population, is kids who've been out of high school for several years who are applying. The tests are woefully inaccurate for them. And as we've noted, they are susceptible to high-priced coaching, as is every human endeavor. There are writing coaches, there are counseling coaches, there are SAT and ACT coaches who, for, in many cases, lots of money, thousands of dollars, can boost your scores significantly. And so that means that an admissions officer at a school that still requires a test, that person can't tell whether your 1100 SAT score was the result of walking into the test and taking it cold, or with having done one practice test at home, or having taken a $1,000 Princeton review course, or having had a $15,000 personal tutor. The tests are not standardized because of the impact of coaching and other factors.
Okay.
I mean, we should also know, that for kids with learning disabilities of all sorts, the tests are not a level playing field, particularly in the COVID era when it's very hard to get tests with appropriate accommodations. So those kids are even further behind the 8 ball when schools require ACT, SAT.
Okay. And our current seniors know that a lot of colleges are test optional for this year. Right now, our juniors are taking the PSAT coming up soon, just to kind of get practice for the SAT, and they're wondering, is it going to be test optional the following year? How do we know kind of what's happening? What trends are we seeing?
Right. Well, we know for a fact that all of the 1,070 schools that were test optional pre-pandemic, places like Temple and Gettysburg and Muhlenberg and Dickinson and others, they're all going to still be test optional. They're not going to revert their policies. Of those who went test optional since mid-March, a number of them have gone test optional permanently or for multiple years. And unfortunately, you're going to have to check the individual school. We do have a listing on FairTest.org under the chronology of going test optional that explains how long those policies might be. But for the next 4 or 5 months, there are going to be lots of changes. And particularly public university systems like the Penn State system, much of which went test optional post-pandemic, we will not know probably until late winter or early spring whether their test optional policies will continue into spring 2021. Now, a number of other state universities have gone test optional for multiple years or even permanently. University of Connecticut, University of Massachusetts, University of California, Oregon, Washington, but places like Penn State have not decided as much. The same is true of the super selective name brand universities like the University of Pennsylvania, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, MIT, Stanford, Johns Hopkins, Duke. We don't know yet what those colleges will require for kids in the class of 2022 and beyond. In some cases, FairTest is working with them. Our goal is to say at least continue the test suspension for another year or two so you can get adequate data to see the test optional works. But schools have been so busy, admissions office have been so busy scrambling to implement these new test optional policies that in many cases they haven't had much time to think about class of 2022 when they're still processing class of 2021. It's tough all around. It's one of the many major disruptions and uncertainties that COVID has brought to this country. And it's frustrating, but 300,000 people have died. And you got to tolerate a little ambiguity here for a while.
And even before COVID, it seemed like there was starting to be a little bit of a trend with more and more colleges going test optional because of some of those other inequities that you mentioned even before COVID-19. With COVID-19, does it seem like there's some more and more colleges are starting to see the value of going test optional, or maybe even just completely not even accepting test scores. Is that a
Oh,
possibility?
yeah, that most definitely true. About 2/3 of the colleges that are test optional now were test optional pre-pandemic. About 1/3 have gone test optional, at least temporarily, in the last 9 months. There was a strong trend last year, 2019, was the fastest growth of the test optional movement ever. And we're seeing places like Bryn Mawr, very selective liberal arts colleges go test optional. Some people believe, and we're less certain, that this is automatically going to happen, that the surge of schools going test optional this year was the end for standardized testing, that we may end up in a situation where a few schools require standardized tests going forward, but the vast majority will not. They will be test optional. But that's not yet a certainty, and it's going to require work and organizing. And students, counselors, parents need to say that they want test optional policies to encourage schools to keep them in place.
Yeah, and we certainly see the value of test optional policies for our students, because from a school counselor's perspective, my perspective is I want to know what we can do that's going to be in the best interest of the student. Maybe having those test scores might help the college make decisions. At least they think it helps them make decisions a little bit easier. But if it creates a lot of hoops and a lot of challenges for our students with cost and time and different concerns with the inequities and things like that, is it really worth it? Is it really helping the student at all? But for now, I guess since we don't know what the future holds, I also have to balance those things with, I need to advise my students wisely to open up the greatest amount of opportunities that they have. So having that SAT or ACT test score can sometimes get their foot in the door at a certain college that still wants to see it. So that's why we're having this discussion to kind of.
Well, I mean, two responses to that. One, counselors has always been FairTest's strongest allies, and I've said repeatedly that if it was up to the college counselors, the SAT and ACT would be gone tomorrow morning. But you don't have power. It's really a perverted system in which all the work to implement the SAT, to administer the SAT, is done by high school staff who are woefully underpaid to proctor the exam. Kids and their parents pay for the exam and go through the mental and emotional anxiety. Colleges get the test scores and lots of other data that kids provide when they register for the test that they use for yield management, making sure that there are tuition paying students in the right number of seats. But colleges don't spend any money. The College Board gets rich on fees, and all the work and angst falls on the back of counselors and kids. That said, going forward, what we recommend right now is that kids do need a belt and suspenders, but they can do it without spending $50 for the College Board or ACT test. You can take a practice test available for free online or from a book and see how you do. And just hold that in abeyance until there is clarity about whether test scores are going to be required at the schools where you're applying. And only then take the test for real. There's no point in giving the companies money and getting the test score on the record if you're not going to use it. And there are plenty of ways to have the practice experience without paying to sit for an administration. So that's what we recommend.
All right. And can you tell me a little bit about FairTest, the organization that you work with, and what information they can give that's kind of helpful to students or support students?
Well, FairTest was created 35 years ago by leaders of student advocacy, education reform, and civil rights groups to serve as the nation's independent watchdog over standardized testing, not just college and graduate school admissions, but K-12 testing and teacher licensing tests as well. So we look at things like the PSSAs, and Keystone exams and whatnot as state tests, as well as college admissions. But for people, for teenagers and their advocates looking to apply to college, we maintain sort of the official master list of test optional schools available on our website at fairtest.org. It's just going to be updated again tonight. We update it quite regularly with new information. And there's tons of information on that site on fairtest.org about what's wrong with the test, what the alternatives to the tests are, and what people can do to change the testing situation. I mean, this country has gone standardized test crazy in the last couple decades, and we need to roll that back to rely on more authentic, meaningful forms of assessment that actually tell us what young people know and can do.
Well, we appreciate what you guys are doing. I know that FairTest has been kind of the go-to place for a long time to see which colleges require the test and which don't, which are test optional. They have a list right there on the website that students can see. But thank you so much for joining us today on this call and for taking the time to share information like this with our students and parents.
Okay, thank you very much for the opportunity.
All right, we'll see you next time.
Okay, good luck to everyone. Stay healthy.